Okay, so our last recipe of the semester, we are going to be making a mini apple pie or hand pie, whichever one you choose to do. So I'm going to be fluffing my flour, and then I'm going to be putting it in my 1/2 cup measuring tool. And then we need to level it off. And I have wax paper under there so I can just dump that back in my container. See how good my fluffing skills are. Pretty good. 2.2. Should be 2.25, so we're good to go. Okay, my next ingredient is my 1/4 teaspoon of sugar for my pie crust. It's just a little bit. I'm going to dump that in my flour bowl. And then I need a 1/4 teaspoon of salt. Level that off and dump that in my flour. Okay, now that I've got my flour, my salt, and my sugar, I'm going to mix that up really well. And then we're going to measure our last ingredient for pie crust, which is our shortening that we need to cut in. And then we'll take care of our water. And we need 4 teaspoons of ice water. You want to make sure you have that sitting to the side, getting nice and cold. I just put ice and water more than I need. And we will take care of measuring our shortening. Okay, for my shortening, I need 3 tablespoons. So I've got 1, 2, 3 right here. So I'm going to put a score mark. And to cut that, I'm also going to double check my weight on that. And then I want to cut it up in some little pieces. Okay. Okay, so there is my 3 tablespoons of shortening. I'm going to cut that up into smaller pieces to make our cutting in job a lot easier. And I don't have a pastry blender with me, so I'm going to do it one of the alternate methods that you learned about earlier in the semester. So you can use a fork, you can use 2 knives, you can use your fingers to cut in. So I'm going to drop that in there. And then I have 2 knives ready to go. I'm not a big fan of the fork one, but I'm going to take the 2 knives and just cut across until I get these into some smaller chunks. And then if you're one of those people that have really cold hands, luckily that happens to be me, I'm going to use the other method because I think it's a lot quicker than the 2 knives. I'm going to get some flour on my fingers and just start kind of pushing the shortening through my fingers with the flour and breaking it up until we get small little crumbles in here. So it's going to take us just a little bit. You can see it goes pretty fast if you're using your hands. Just if you have really warm hands, this is not a good method because you will start melting your shortening. And you can see it's starting to get crumbly. We want to get rid of some of those bigger lumps in there. So it doesn't take very long. So we've got a little bit of crumb there, and I'm going to stop right there. Okay, so I've got my crumbs. I'm going to go ahead and push them to one side of my bowl, and you'll see why in a moment. And you want a fork for this step. So if you had a pastry blender, get rid of it. And I've got my 1 teaspoon measuring spoon, and I am going to get a teaspoon of my ice water, and I'm going to pour it in along the edge of those crumbs. And I'm going to go ahead and do 2. We don't want to put all 4 in at once because it might be too much water depending upon the air or moisture that's in the air. And then you want to take the tines of the fork and drag those crumbs through the water. This is a really good method I learned in college from my foods professor, Miss Kissick. And until you learn how this dough should feel and look like, it's a really good way not to put too much water in your pie crust. And this is such a little amount, it doesn't take you very long to do this method. But see how it starts to stick together and ball up? That's what you want. Okay? So you want it to stick together in one big ball. So you can see that was 2 teaspoons of water. And I'm still grabbing a little bit more. I'm probably only going to need to add that other teaspoon because when we pick this up, and we crunch it in our hands, it should hold together. So that's what your dough should look like, okay? So I'm going to drop some more crumbs there, and I'm going to add another teaspoon of water to the edge there. And I may need the last teaspoon, I may need just part of it. So just take those crumbs and pull them through the water. And if they get kind of, you can see the water in there, just pull it through. Just use the tines of the fork to push it into. What we don't want is a bunch of crumbs that won't hold together. Okay, if they're going to hold together, that's what we want. Okay, I might need just a little bit more water. Okay, so I can pick it up and test, and it doesn't crumble apart, so it's good. So we have just a little bit of crumbs. That whole teaspoon of water is not going to be what I need. So I'm going to take my 1/4 teaspoon and get some ice water in it and drop that in there. Okay, I know that's just a little bit of water, but we don't need that full teaspoon. I think 1/4 to 1/2 will be enough. And it will just depend on the day you're making this. If there's a lot of moisture in the air, you might need less water. Okay, and so I've got all my dough done now. So what we're going to do is bring that together in one big ball. I'm going to split it in half, flatten it out into 2 different patties so that we have 2 pieces of dough to work with to make our pie. And I'm going to let that set in the fridge after I do that. Okay, so I've just kind of moved this around the bowl. You don't want to keep mixing it, just gather it up so it forms a ball. And I'm going to put that on my scale here and see what our weight is as soon as it zeroes out. Okay, so we have 112, so roughly 65, 66 grams. So I'm going to cut this in half. So then I have dough for the top of my pie and for the bottom of my pie. A little light there. Okay, that's pretty good. And then what you're going to do is make this into a little ball and just flatten it out. That way when you come back to work with it, it's in the shape that you want. And I'm going to wrap that up in my wax paper. And I will put that in a storage container in my fridge until I'm ready for it, so then I can go work on my filling. So you can see that's all wrapped up. And you don't want to play with this like Play-Doh, because the more you play with it, the tougher it gets. But wrap that disc up and then store it in your refrigerator until it's time for rolling out your pie crust.